In this video, I'm going to demonstrate why we used a predetermined overhead rate using a cost driver. For this purpose, assume that we have a manufacturing environment in which we make two types of chairs, the fancy chair and the rustic chair. And that for a particular run, we made 100 of each, so that the total production is 200 units. Further, assume that total overhead is $400 for that period. One simple approach to allocate this overhead, which by the way, this overhead includes electricity, depreciation. It also includes indirect materials, indirect labor, and many other overhead items related to the manufacture of the product. If we take these $400 and we allocate them to each chair, we could take a real simple approach and say, okay, divide the $400 by the total number of units produced and come up with $2 per unit. So I would allocate that as such, $2 here and $2 there. The only problem with this simplistic approach is that you might be incorrectly estimating overhead given the circumstances of each product. So if we can imagine that a fancy chair requires more labor, for example, maybe it needs to be sanded down, maybe it needs to be painted much nicer, whereas the rustic chair, we just basically assemble it and leave the wood as is. If that's the case, then you can clearly see how this $2 per unit might be understated based on the real amount that should be allocated to the fancy chair. And then this might be overstated given that there's very little work or very little consumption of overhead. So if we think that way, then we would probably say that this approach is not ideal. And I'm just going to exit out to emphasize this. Instead, we go in there and say, okay, maybe we can use a cost driver to better allocate overhead. And there's many different cost drivers we could use, but I'm going to choose direct labor hours as our cost driver, given that it is one of the one of the attributes that distinguishes the fancy and the rustic chair. We said that the fancy chair requires a lot more work, whereas the rustic chair requires less work. So I'll just come up with these estimates here and say that to produce 100 chairs, it takes 75 direct labor hours, and to produce 100 rustic chairs, it only takes 25 hours. So the production run basically requires 100 direct labor hours for the manufacture of 200 chairs. If we come up with a predetermined overhead rate based on that cost driver, we would still allocate the $400 of overhead that I mentioned here, but instead of allocating it over units as we did here, I would allocate it over direct labor hours. So that would give me a predetermined overhead rate of $4 per direct labor hour, not per unit. So given that information, I can estimate how much overhead I will give per unit. I said it was 75 hours for 100 chairs, so on a per chair basis, it's 0.75 hours. And then here I said it was 25 hours for 100 chairs, so on a per chair basis is 0.25 hours, or 15 minutes. So my estimate here would basically be the number of hours per chair times the rate, the overhead rate per direct labor hour. So in this case it's 4, and when I multiply that, I get $3 over here. And if I do the same for the rustic chair, the number of hours per chair times the rate of $4, I come up with 1. So given this approach, I am allocating the same $400 to the 2 chairs, but I'm coming up with a system that is way more appropriate given the circumstances here. Here I would allocate evenly, perhaps incorrectly estimating overhead per unit, whereas here I'm saying, hey, the fancy chair requires more overhead, maybe it should be allocated more overhead as well. And the same goes true here. So this avoids the overestimation here and the underestimation here that we saw earlier.